Waitress told the billionaire, "My grandma has a ring like yours." What happened next shocked everyone. Regina's hand trembled as she refilled the champagne glass, her eyes fixed on the emerald signet ring that had haunted her childhood memories. "Excuse me, sir," she whispered, her voice barely cutting through the restaurant's elegant murmur. "My grandmother had a ring exactly like yours." Bradley looked up with mild annoyance, but Regina didn't see his expression. She was staring at the ring that might hold the key to everything her grandmother had refused to tell her about their family's buried past. The private dining room at Le Bernardin hummed with the particular energy that comes when Manhattan's most powerful people gather to reshape the city's future. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany tables where conversations worth billions unfolded in hushed tones, while servers moved like ghosts between discussions that could determine which neighborhoods would thrive and which would be transformed beyond recognition. Regina navigated this rarefied world with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd learned to observe without being observed, to serve without being seen. At 29, she possessed an elegance that would have fit seamlessly into the world she served, if circumstances had been different. Her natural hair was styled in a sleek chignon, her movements graceful despite the weight of serving trays, her smile professional but genuine when customers bothered to make eye contact. She approached table 12 with the same efficient courtesy she'd perfected over 3 years of working Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. The celebration dinner was winding down, 6 men in bespoke suits toasting what appeared to be a successful business venture, their voices carrying the particular satisfaction that came from deals that would reshape other people's lives. "Gentlemen," she said, setting down fresh glasses of Dom Perignon with practiced precision, "compliments of the house to celebrate your successful closing." The man at the head of the table, mid-30s, dark hair styled with the casual perfection that money could buy, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than Regina made in 6 months, raised his glass with evident satisfaction. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying the confident charm of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "It's not every day you close a deal that's going to transform an entire neighborhood." Regina had heard similar conversations countless times in her years serving New York's elite, developers celebrating acquisitions, real estate moguls toasting gentrification projects, investors discussing the improvement of communities that had been home to families for generations. The language was always sanitized, clinical, as if they were discussing urban planning rather than displacing lives. But as she moved to clear empty plates, something caught her eye that made her blood freeze. The man's right hand bore a distinctive emerald signet ring, antique by the look of it, with an intricate family crest carved into the deep green stone. The band was thick gold, worn smooth in places that suggested generations of wear. The ring was identical to one Regina had seen countless times as a child, worn on a thin chain around her grandmother's neck until the day she died 5 years ago. Grandma Rose had treasured that ring like a sacred relic, touching it whenever she was lost in thought, but she'd never explained where it came from or why it mattered so much. Regina's hands stilled as memories flooded back. Late nights when she'd found her grandmother staring at old photographs with the ring pressed against her heart, whispered conversations on the phone in a language that sounded like Portuguese but might have been something else entirely, the way Grandma Rose's face would close whenever Regina asked about their family history. "Everything all right, miss?" The man's voice cut through her reverie, and Regina realized she'd been staring at his hand for longer than was professionally appropriate. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, forcing her professional smile back into place. That's a beautiful ring you're wearing." Bradley Vaughn glanced down at his hand with mild surprise. The ring had been his grandfather's, passed down through 3 generations of Vaughn men along with the real estate empire and the Upper East Side townhouse and all the other trappings of inherited wealth. He'd worn it so long he barely noticed it anymore. "Family heirloom," he said with the casual dismissiveness of someone discussing inherited furniture. Been in the family for decades. It's very distinctive, Regina continued, her heart hammering as she tried to find the courage to voice what she was thinking. The crest design is quite unusual. Bradley looked up at her more carefully now, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the subservient nature of her position. There was something about her attention to the ring that felt different from casual interest. "You know something about heraldry?" he asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier dismissal. Regina hesitated, aware that she was crossing the invisible line between server and customer, between her world and his. "I studied art history at Columbia," she said carefully. "I've seen similar designs in Portuguese colonial artifacts, though the craftsmanship on yours suggests it's quite old." "Portuguese?" Bradley's eyebrows rose. "That's interesting. My family's always been told it was Irish in origin." Before Regina could respond, one of Bradley's companions, a silver-haired man whose impatience was evident in every gesture, cleared his throat pointedly. "Bradley, perhaps we could save the genealogy discussion for after we finish celebrating your Harlem acquisition? Some of us have early morning meetings." The word Harlem hit Regina like a physical blow. Her grandmother had lived in Harlem her entire adult life, in a brownstone that had been in their family since the 1940s. The building had been sold to developers 18 months ago. The residents relocated to make way for luxury condos that none of them could afford. "The Harlem Project," Regina said slowly, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed beginning to shift into focus. "Which buildings?" Bradley seemed surprised by her continued engagement with their conversation. "A block of brownstones on 125th Street. Beautiful old architecture that we're restoring to its original glory." "Original glory for whom?" The words slipped out before Regina could stop them, carrying an edge that made the entire table fall silent. Bradley stared at her, noting the shift in her demeanor from professional courtesy to something approaching challenge. "Excuse me?" Regina felt the weight of 6 pairs of eyes studying her, measuring her worthiness for continued attention. She knew she should apologize, retreat to the safety of professional invisibility, let these men continue their celebration without interference from someone whose opinion they'd never solicited. But the ring on Bradley's finger seemed to pulse with significance she couldn't ignore, and the casual way he described displacing an entire community made something fierce awaken in her chest. "I'm sorry," she said, though her tone carried no apology. "It's just that when you say, restoring, it sounds like those buildings were empty. But they weren't. They were home to families who'd lived there for generations." "Well, yes," Bradley replied, his voice taking on the patient tone used to explain obvious truths to those too naive to understand business realities. "Urban development requires some displacement. But we're creating something beautiful, valuable, that will benefit the entire neighborhood. Benefit by making it unaffordable to the people who built that neighborhood," Regina said, her professional mask slipping entirely. "Benefit by erasing the history and culture that made those streets vibrant in the first place." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Bradley's companions exchanged glances that mixed embarrassment with irritation, clearly uncomfortable with having their celebration interrupted by a server's social commentary. "Miss," the silver-haired man said sharply, "I think you've overstepped your bounds here. Perhaps you should focus on your job and leave urban planning to people who understand these complexities." But Bradley held up a hand, his attention focused entirely on Regina with an intensity that surprised them both. "No, let her speak. I'm curious about her perspective." He leaned back in his chair, studying Regina with the kind of attention he usually reserved for complex business negotiations. "You seem to have strong feelings about this particular project. Any specific reason why?" Regina felt the moment crystallize around her, the choice between safe silence and dangerous truth. She thought about her grandmother's stories, carefully edited versions of a life that had included losses too painful to fully share. She thought about the ring hidden beneath Bradley's expensive sleeve, identical to the one that had been her grandmother's most treasured possession. Most of all, she thought about the brownstone on 125th Street where her grandmother had lived for 60 years, where Regina had spent childhood summers learning about resilience and dignity and the importance of remembering where you came from. Because, she said quietly, my grandmother lived in one of those buildings you bought. Building 47, apartment 3B. She'd been there since 1962, raised 4 children there, survived the neighborhood's worst years and its best years. And your restoration meant she had to spend her last months in a nursing home in Queens because there was nowhere else she could afford. Have you ever realized that the stranger serving your coffee might be connected to your life in ways you never imagined? Sometimes the people we don't see, don't acknowledge, don't think about, are the ones whose stories intersect with ours in the most profound ways. The silence that followed was profound. Bradley felt something shift in his chest, not quite guilt, but a recognition that the urban development he'd celebrated was connected to real people, real losses, real grief that he'd never bothered to consider. I'm sorry for your loss, he said finally, and for the first time that evening, his voice carried genuine emotion rather than polite courtesy. Regina nodded, accepting the condolence while studying his face for signs of understanding that went deeper than social pleasantries. Mr. Bradley Vaughn. Mr. Vaughn, my grandmother Rose Martinez lived in that building her entire adult life. And she wore a ring on a chain around her neck that was identical to the one you're wearing right now. She never told me where it came from, but she treasured it like it held the secrets of our entire family. Bradley looked down at his ring with new eyes, seeing it not as inherited decoration but as a potential key to mysteries he'd never thought to explore. When did she pass away? 5 years ago. But before she died, she made me promise to find out the truth about our family's history. She said there were stories that needed to be told, wrongs that needed to be acknowledged. Regina paused, gathering courage for what she was about to say. Mr. Vaughn, I think my grandmother's ring and yours are connected. And I think you might know more about my family's history than you realize. The private dining room at Le Bernardin seemed to shrink around their conversation, the elegant space suddenly feeling charged with possibilities that neither Regina nor Bradley had anticipated when the evening began. The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to escape what had become an unexpectedly personal encounter. Bradley, the silver-haired man said pointedly, perhaps we should adjourn for the evening. This seems like a conversation better suited to a more private setting. But Bradley was studying Regina with the intense focus he usually reserved for complex acquisitions, his mind racing through implications he couldn't yet fully grasp. Actually, gentlemen, you go ahead. I think I need to hear more about this. As his companions gathered their things with barely concealed relief, Bradley gestured to the empty chair beside him. Please sit, and tell me more about your grandmother's ring. Regina hesitated, acutely aware that accepting his invitation would transform her from server to something else entirely, collaborator, perhaps, or adversary. Either way, it meant stepping out of the safety of professional invisibility into territory that felt both dangerous and necessary. I should probably finish my shift, she said, glancing toward the other tables that still needed attention. I'll handle it, Bradley said, reaching for his phone. Within minutes, he'd arranged for her tables to be covered and for the restaurant's private dining room to remain available for their conversation. Regina sank into the leather chair, her server's apron suddenly feeling costume-like in this new context. Up close, she could see details about Bradley that had been obscured by distance and professional dynamics. The way his confidence seemed to cover something more uncertain, the quality of attention that suggested intelligence tempered by privilege. "Tell me about the ring," he said simply. Regina pulled out her phone and scrolled to a folder of photographs she digitized from her grandmother's belongings. She found the one she was looking for, Rose Martinez at age 75, sitting in her brownstone apartment, the emerald ring visible on its chain against her burgundy sweater. Bradley stared at the image, his face paling as recognition hit him. The ring in the photograph was unmistakably identical to his own. Same emerald, same intricate crest, same distinctive band. But seeing it around an elderly black woman's neck raised questions that challenged everything he'd been told about his family's history. "My God," he whispered. "They're identical." "More than identical," Regina said, leaning forward with growing intensity. "I think they might be a matched set. Look at this." She scrolled to another photograph, a close-up of her grandmother's ring that revealed details invisible in the first image. The crest showed two interlocking circles, but only one was complete. The other appeared deliberately incomplete, as if it had been designed to connect with something else. Bradley examined his own ring more carefully than he had in years, noting for the first time that his family crest also seemed incomplete, a design that suggested connection to something missing rather than standing alone. "When did your grandmother get this ring?" he asked. "That's what I've been trying to figure out for 5 years," Regina replied. "She never talked about it directly, but I found some documents after she died that suggest it came from before she moved to Harlem. There were letters in Portuguese, some photographs from Brazil, and references to a family named Vaughn." The name hit Bradley like lightning. "Vaughn? Are you sure?" The letters mentioned a Senora Vaughn who had helped my grandmother during what the documents called difficult times. But the details were vague, like someone had been careful not to write down anything too specific. Bradley felt the foundations of his understanding beginning to shift. His family's wealth had been built by his great-grandfather, who'd made his fortune in international trade during the 1940s and 1950s. But the specifics of those early business dealings had always been vague, family lore rather than documented history. "Regina," he said slowly, "what was your grandmother's maiden name?" "Santos. Rose Santos, before she married my grandfather Martinez." The name meant nothing to Bradley, but something about the Portuguese connection, the timing, the mysterious letters, suggested layers of family history that had been carefully obscured rather than simply forgotten. "My great-grandfather, Harrison Vaughn, did extensive business in South America," Bradley said, thinking aloud. "Coffee trade, mostly, but also other investments. The family always said he was brilliant at reading emerging markets." "What kind of other investments?" Regina asked, though something in her tone suggested she was beginning to suspect the answer. Bradley was quiet for a long moment, pieces of half-remembered family stories and deliberately vague explanations beginning to form a picture he didn't want to see clearly. "I don't know the details," he admitted. "My grandfather was always secretive about the early years of the business. Said some things were better left in the past." Regina felt anger rising in her chest, not just at Bradley, but at the careful way wealthy families sanitize their histories, erasing the human costs of their success. "Mr. Vaughn, my grandmother worked as a housekeeper her entire life in America. But according to the documents I found, she came from a family that owned significant property in Brazil. Property that disappeared sometime in the 1940s. The implication hung between them like a blade. Bradley understood what she was suggesting, that his family's fortune might have been built on exploitation of people like her grandmother, that the wealth he'd inherited carried debts that had never been acknowledged or repaid. "You think my great-grandfather cheated your grandmother's family somehow," he said. "I think your great-grandfather did business with people who had no legal recourse when those deals went bad," Regina replied, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone who'd spent years trying to piece together deliberately obscured truth. I think my grandmother came to America because staying in Brazil meant poverty for her and her children. Bradley stared at his ring, seeing it now not as inherited privilege but as potential evidence of inherited guilt. Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, that was 80 years ago. My great-grandfather, your grandmother, everyone involved in whatever happened is dead. But the consequences aren't dead, Regina said sharply. Your family built wealth on foundations that displaced mine. You've been living in luxury funded by losses my family never recovered from. And now you're displacing us again, buying up neighborhoods where people like my grandmother found refuge and turning them into playgrounds for people like you. The words cut deeper than Bradley had expected, forcing him to confront connections he'd never considered between his inherited privilege and other people's inherited disadvantage. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice carrying a mixture of defensive anger and genuine confusion. "I want the truth," Regina said simply. "I want to know what really happened between our families. I want to understand why my grandmother spent 60 years looking at that ring like it held secrets too dangerous to share." Before Bradley could respond, Regina's phone buzzed with a text from the restaurant manager. "Everything okay? Mr. Vaughn's assistant called about extending your conversation, but I need to know if you're coming back to work." The intrusion of practical reality reminded them both that they were still in a restaurant, still technically in an employer-employee dynamic, still navigating a conversation that had exploded far beyond the boundaries of normal social interaction. "I should go," Regina said, starting to rise from her chair. "Wait," Bradley said, reaching out to stop her. "This conversation isn't finished. If there's truth to be found about our family's connection, I want to find it too." Regina studied his face, searching for signs of genuine commitment versus guilt-driven impulse. "But what's in it for you to dig up family secrets that might make you look bad?" Bradley was quiet for a moment, considering the question more seriously than she'd expected. "Because," he said finally, "I've spent my entire life building on foundations I never examined. If those foundations are rotten, I need to know. And if they hurt people, I need to understand how to make that right." "Making it right might cost you more than you're prepared to pay," Regina warned. "Then I guess we'll find out what kind of man I really am," Bradley replied, his voice carrying a resolve that surprised them both. As Regina gathered her things to leave, she felt the strange electricity of a moment that might change everything. For 36 years, Bradley had lived with inherited wealth and inherited assumptions about how that wealth had been earned. For 29 years, Regina had lived with inherited questions and inherited silence about losses her family had sustained. Now, connected by identical rings and converging histories, they were about to discover whether truth could heal wounds that had festered for generations, or whether some secrets were buried too deep to safely unearth. "My shift ends at 11, Regina said as she reached the dining room door. "If you're serious about finding answers, meet me at the Hungarian pastry shop on Amsterdam at midnight. Bring whatever family documents you can find." "Why there?" Bradley asked. Regina's smile was sharp with irony. "Because it's the kind of place where people like me can afford to have conversations about people like you. And if we're going to discuss how your family's wealth was built, we should do it somewhere that wealth can't control the outcome." As she disappeared back into the restaurant's working world, Bradley sat alone in the private dining room, staring at his ring with new eyes and wondering if he was about to discover that everything he'd believed about his inheritance was built on lies. The Hungarian pastry shop at midnight felt like a sanctuary from Manhattan's relentless energy. Dim lighting cast warm shadows across mismatched tables and chairs, while the lingering scent of coffee and pastries created the kind of intimate atmosphere where secrets could be safely shared. Regina arrived first, choosing a corner table that afforded privacy while keeping the front door in view. She'd changed out of her server's uniform into jeans and a Columbia University sweatshirt that spoke to the life she'd put on hold to pay bills and care for family. Spread across the table were photocopies of documents she'd never shown anyone, letters, photographs, and legal papers that painted a picture of loss too complex for simple explanations. Bradley entered at exactly midnight, looking distinctly out of place in his expensive suit among the cafe's late-night crowd of students and insomniacs. He carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most of the other patrons made in a month, his discomfort with the surroundings evident in the careful way he navigated between tables. "Thank you for coming," Regina said as he settled into the chair across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Bradley admitted, setting his briefcase on the floor beside his chair. "I spent 3 hours going through family documents, and what I found." He paused, his expression troubled. "Let's just say it raises questions I'm not sure I'm prepared to answer." Regina studied his face, seeing genuine distress rather than the polite concern she'd expected. "What kind of questions?" Bradley opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. "My great-grandfather's business records from the 1940s. I'd never looked at them closely before, always assumed they were just boring financial documents. But tonight I read them carefully." He spread several papers across the table, his hands not quite steady. Harrison Vaughn wasn't just trading coffee in Brazil. He was buying properties from families who were being forced to sell due to political pressures, economic instability, sometimes outright persecution. Regina felt her breath catch. What kind of persecution? Mixed-race families, primarily. People who were vulnerable because of racial classifications under Brazilian law at the time. Bradley's voice grew quieter as he continued. "The documents suggest my great-grandfather specifically targeted families who couldn't seek legal recourse when deals went badly." The words hit Regina like physical blows. She reached for one of her grandmother's letters, her hands trembling as she translated the Portuguese she'd been studying for 5 years. "My grandmother wrote about a Senor Harrison who promised to help her family keep their coffee plantation," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She trusted him because he spoke Portuguese, because he understood their situation, because he promised that cooperation would mean protection. "What happened?" Bradley asked, though his expression suggested he was beginning to understand. "According to this letter, written to a cousin in 1947, my great-grandmother signed papers she couldn't read, transferring property rights in exchange for what she thought was a partnership agreement." Regina's anger was building with each word. But the partnership was a lie. Within 6 months, her family had lost everything. Bradley stared at the documents spread between them, seeing his family's wealth in a completely new light. "Regina, if this is true." "If." Regina's voice carried a sharp edge. "Mr. Vaughn, these aren't speculation. These are primary source documents from people who lived through what your great-grandfather did to them." She pulled out a photograph, a large estate house surrounded by coffee plants, with a young woman who looked remarkably like Regina standing on the front steps. "This was my great-grandmother's plantation. Fazenda Santos. 300 acres that had been in her family for 60 years. What's it worth now?" Bradley asked, though he seemed to dread the answer. "I hired a property assessor last year to research it," Regina replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was sharing. "Current value, if it were still producing coffee? Approximately $47 million. The number hung in the air between them like a judgment. Bradley felt the weight of inherited guilt settling on his shoulders as he realized that his family's Manhattan townhouse, his Ivy League education, his entire privileged existence had been funded by theft disguised as business. "Regina," he said slowly, "I had no idea. My family never talked about the specifics of how the original wealth was accumulated." "Of course they didn't," Regina replied, her disappointment sharp and personal. Rich families never talk about the specifics. They prefer phrases like savvy international investments and emerging market opportunities. It sounds so much better than stealing land from people who couldn't fight back. Bradley winced at the accuracy of her description. It was exactly the kind of language his family had always used, sanitized, clinical, designed to obscure rather than illuminate the human costs of their success. "What do you want me to do with this information?" he asked. "I want you to acknowledge what happened," Regina said. "I want you to understand that your family's wealth was built on my family's loss. I want you to recognize that when you buy buildings in Harlem and displace long-time residents, you're continuing a pattern of exploitation that goes back generations." And then what? "Even if I acknowledge all of this, it doesn't change the past. It doesn't bring back your great-grandmother's plantation or undo 80 years of consequences." Regina leaned forward, her eyes blazing with conviction. "No, but it might change the future. It might influence how you use your wealth going forward. It might make you think twice before you celebrate displacing communities that are already struggling." Before Bradley could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression darkened. "I'm sorry, I have to take this. It's my business partner." As he stepped away to answer the call, Regina heard fragments of a heated conversation about the Harlem Project and community resistance and timeline pressures. When Bradley returned to the table, his face was pale. "There's been a development," he said quietly. "The community group fighting our Harlem Project has hired a lawyer. They're claiming that some of the buildings we purchased were sold under duress, that longtime residents weren't given adequate time to secure alternative housing." Regina felt a cold satisfaction wash over her. Good for them. "Regina, this could delay or even kill the entire project. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in potential losses. You're talking about hundreds of millions in profits built on displacing people who've already been displaced too many times," Regina corrected. "Maybe it's time your family took some losses for a change." The harshness of her words surprised them both. Bradley stared at her, seeing not just anger but decades of accumulated injustice seeking expression through someone who'd finally found a target. "You think I deserve to lose everything because of what my great-grandfather did 80 years ago? I think you deserve to understand what losing everything feels like," Regina replied, her voice carrying the weight of inherited grief. "My grandmother never owned property again after what your great-grandfather did to her family. She worked as a housekeeper for 60 years, cleaning other people's houses while dreaming of the plantation she'd lost. But punishing me doesn't help your grandmother or anyone else who was hurt back then. Doesn't it?" Regina pulled out her phone and showed Bradley a news article she'd saved. "This is about the community organization fighting your Harlem Project. They're not just trying to stop one development, they're trying to create a model for how communities can resist displacement." Bradley read the article, seeing his Harlem Project described not as urban renewal but as cultural destruction, not as investment but as invasion. The community group was led by longtime residents who'd watched their neighborhood change around them, pricing out families who'd been there for generations. "If your project fails," Regina continued, "it sends a message that communities have power, that developers can't just steamroll through neighborhoods because residents don't have expensive lawyers and political connections. What would you do if you discovered that your entire life had been built on someone else's suffering and that your current actions were continuing patterns of harm you'd never bothered to examine? Sometimes the hardest truths to face are the ones that require us to change not just our understanding, but our choices." Bradley felt trapped between competing loyalties, his responsibility to business partners and investors who trusted him with their money, and his growing recognition that their project represented exactly the kind of exploitation his family had practiced for generations. "Regina," he said carefully, What if there was a way to make this right? Not just acknowledging the past, but actually addressing the harm that's been done. What are you suggesting? I don't know yet, but looking at these documents, seeing the connection between our families, understanding how my wealth was built on your family's losses. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Maybe there's a way to use that wealth differently, to break the cycle instead of continuing it. Regina studied his face, searching for signs of genuine commitment versus guilt-driven impulse. That sounds like the kind of thing rich people say when they want to feel better about themselves without actually changing anything fundamental. Maybe, Bradley admitted, but maybe it's also the beginning of actually taking responsibility for inherited advantages I never earned and inherited debts I never acknowledged. As the cafe around them began to empty, leaving them increasingly alone with documents that revealed generations of buried truth, both Regina and Bradley realized they were approaching a choice that would define not just their relationship, but their understanding of justice, responsibility, and what it meant to inherit more than money. To inherit the obligation to either perpetuate or transform the systems that had shaped their vastly different lives. The question hanging between them was whether Bradley's wealth and Regina's knowledge could combine to create something new, or whether the weight of historical injustice would prove too heavy for individual action to address. 1 week later, Bradley stood in the boardroom of Vaughn Development on the 48th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, facing 8 of the city's most powerful real estate investors. The conference table gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting the tension that had been building since he'd called this emergency meeting 24 hours earlier. "Bradley," said Harrison Reed, the silver-haired man who'd been at the Le Bernardin dinner, "we need to talk about your sudden change of heart regarding the Harlem project. Our investors are getting nervous about delays and community resistance." "The community resistance isn't the problem," Bradley replied, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "The problem is that we've been approaching development as if the people already living in these neighborhoods don't matter." The room erupted in the kind of controlled chaos that happens when powerful men encounter unexpected challenges to their assumptions. Voices rose and overlapped. Concerns about profit margins, legal obligations to investors, the practical impossibility of redeveloping urban areas without displacement. "Son," said his own father, Marcus Vaughn, from his position at the head of the table, "I understand you're having some kind of moral crisis, but we have fiduciary responsibilities. You can't just abandon a $500 million project because you've developed a conscience." Bradley felt the weight of expectations that had shaped his entire life. The assumption that Vaughn men prioritized profit over people, growth over justice, shareholder value over community stability. For 36 years, he'd fulfilled those expectations without question. But the documents spread across his home office, the conversations with Regina, the growing understanding of how his wealth had been built, all of it had crystallized into a recognition that continuing old patterns wasn't just morally wrong, it was personally unbearable. "I'm not abandoning the project," Bradley said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I'm proposing we fundamentally change it." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that precedes either breakthrough or catastrophe. "What are you talking about?" Harrison asked. Bradley moved to the presentation screen, where architectural plans for luxury condos glowed in pristine detail. "What if instead of displacing the existing community, we partnered with them? What if we developed affordable housing alongside market-rate units? What if we created spaces for the businesses and cultural institutions that make Harlem valuable in the first place?" "That's economic suicide," Marcus said flatly. "Mixed-income development doesn't generate the returns our investors expect." "Doesn't it?" Bradley clicked to a new slide, financial projections he'd worked on for 72 hours straight. "These numbers assume we develop half the planned units as affordable housing, reserve commercial space for existing Harlem businesses, and create a community land trust that gives residents ownership stakes in the neighborhood's future. The room studied the projections in stunned silence. The returns were lower than originally projected, but still profitable, and more importantly, sustainable in ways that pure gentrification never was. Where did this analysis come from? Harrison demanded. These projections assume community cooperation that we'll never get. Actually, Bradley said, we already have it. He clicked to another slide, a photograph from a community meeting held 3 nights earlier in a Harlem church basement. The image showed Bradley and Regina standing before a packed room of longtime residents, business owners, and community activists. I've been working with Regina Martinez, a Columbia-trained art historian whose family was displaced by our original development plan. She's helped me understand that community resistance isn't obstruction, it's expertise. These residents know better than anyone what their neighborhood needs. Marcus leaned forward, his face flushed with anger and confusion. Bradley, what the hell has gotten into you? You're talking about partnering with the very people who are trying to stop our project. I'm talking about acknowledging that they were right to try to stop it, Bradley replied. Dad, I've been doing research into our family's business history, into how our wealth was originally accumulated. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus's expression shifted from anger to something approaching fear. That's ancient history, son. Whatever you think you've discovered, I've discovered that our family fortune was built on stealing property from vulnerable families in Brazil during the 1940s, Bradley said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. I've seen the documents. I've met the granddaughter of one of the families we cheated. The boardroom erupted again, but this time the chaos was different, shocked recognition rather than mere disagreement. Several board members began talking rapidly among themselves, while others reached for their phones to consult with lawyers. Even if that's true, Harrison said when the noise died down, it doesn't change our legal obligations in the present. We have contracts, investors, commitments that can't be altered because you've developed feelings about historical injustices. Actually, a new voice said from the boardroom door, those legal obligations might be more flexible than you think. Everyone turned to see Regina entering the room, dressed in a professional navy suit that transformed her from server to advocate. Behind her walked an elderly black woman carrying a briefcase and moving with the careful dignity of someone who'd spent decades fighting battles in rooms exactly like this one. Gentlemen, Regina said, I'd like you to meet attorney Josephine Carter, who's been representing Harlem community organizations for 30 years. Ms. Carter has some information about your Harlem project that you need to hear. Ms. Carter moved to the conference table with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd learned that power came not from intimidation but from preparation. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of legal documents. Mr. Vaughn, she said, addressing Bradley directly, Ms. Martinez has shared with me your family's historical connection to property theft in Brazil, as well as your current development plans in Harlem. I've been researching the legal framework surrounding both situations. She spread documents across the conference table, property deeds, zoning regulations, and historical records that painted a picture none of the Vaughn Development Board members wanted to see. Your current Harlem project involves buildings that were originally purchased by your great-grandfather Harrison Vaughn in 1963, Ms. Carter continued. Properties he acquired using capital that, according to Ms. Martinez's research, was obtained through fraudulent transactions in Brazil. Marcus Vaughn's face had gone white. That's impossible. The Brazil business was completely separate from our New York operations. Actually, sir, it wasn't. Ms. Carter produced a document that looked like it had been preserved in an evidence locker. This is a transfer record from Chase Manhattan Bank, dated 1962, showing movement of funds from Harrison Vaughn's South American accounts to his New York real estate investments. The implication was clear and devastating. The money used to buy the original Harlem properties, the foundation of Vaughn Development's local portfolio, had been stolen from families like Regina's grandmother. Furthermore, Ms. Carter continued, several of the current residents your development would displace are descendants of families who were cheated out of property in the 1940s and 1960s. This creates potential legal grounds for challenging not just your current project, but the ownership structure of properties your family has held for decades. The room fell into the kind of silence that precedes seismic shifts. Bradley felt everything he'd inherited, wealth, property, social position, hanging in the balance of decisions made by men he'd never met, whose choices were finally coming due. "What are you proposing?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Regina stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. "We're proposing a partnership. Community ownership of land and buildings, shared profits from development, genuine affordable housing that serves existing residents rather than displacing them." "And if we refuse?" Harrison asked. Ms. Carter smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd been building toward this moment for 30 years. "Then we take this case to federal court and challenge the legal foundation of your property holdings. All of them." Bradley looked around the table at 8 powerful men whose comfortable assumptions about inherited wealth and development rights were crumbling in real time. He thought about his conversation with Regina in the Hungarian pastry shop, about inherited debts that had never been acknowledged, about patterns of exploitation that could either continue or finally be broken. "Gentlemen," he said, "I think it's time we started building wealth by creating value instead of extracting it. I think it's time the Vaughn family learned how to develop communities instead of displacing them." As the implications of his words settled around the room, Bradley realized he was betting everything, his inheritance, his business relationships, his social position, on the belief that justice delayed was not justice denied, and that some debts could never be paid until they were first acknowledged. The question now was whether his partners would choose transformation or whether they would choose to fight a battle that might cost them everything they'd built on foundations that had never been as solid as they'd believed. 18 months later, the Harlem Community Heritage Center stood as a testament to what was possible when inherited privilege chose partnership over domination. The building that had once housed luxury condos for wealthy outsiders now contained affordable apartments for longtime residents, commercial space for local businesses, and a community center where the neighborhood's children could learn about their history while planning their futures. Regina stood in the center's main gallery, surrounded by photographs and artifacts that told the story of Harlem's resilience, but also the story of how one family's wealth had been built on another family's losses, and how that wealth had ultimately been used to begin healing rather than continuing harm. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a display case containing 2 emerald rings, her grandmother's and Bradley's, finally united after 75 years of separation. The placard beside them read, "These rings belonged to Brazilian families whose partnership was destroyed by exploitation. Their reunion represents our commitment to building partnerships based on justice rather than extraction." "The opening is beautiful," said Josephine Carter, approaching with the satisfied expression of someone who'd lived to see justice take tangible form. "Your grandmother would be so proud." Regina smiled, touching the simple gold chain around her neck where her grandmother's ring had once hung. "She always said the truth had its own power, that secrets kept people trapped but sharing them could set everyone free." Through the gallery's large windows, she could see the mixed-income housing complex that had replaced the original luxury development plans. Children played in courtyards designed by community members, while adults gathered in common spaces that honored Harlem's cultural heritage while creating space for its continued evolution. "Regina!" Bradley's voice came from behind her, carrying the warmth that had developed between them over months of working together to transform his family's legacy. The community board meeting is about to start. Are you ready? She turned to find him dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, a far cry from the expensive suits that had marked his earlier life as a traditional developer. The past 18 months had transformed him from someone who inherited wealth without question into someone who used resources to build rather than extract value. Ready, she said, gathering her notes for the presentation that would determine the next phase of their partnership. The community board meeting was held in the center's main room, packed with residents who'd become partners in reshaping their neighborhood rather than victims of its transformation. The energy was different from typical community meetings, engaged rather than defensive, hopeful rather than desperate. Before we discuss the Phase 2 development proposals, Regina began, I want to share some news about the broader impact of what we've built here. She clicked to a presentation slide showing a map of Manhattan marked with dots of different colors. In the past year, 7 other development projects across the city have adopted some version of our community partnership model. 3 more are in planning stages. The room erupted in applause, not just for the immediate impact, but for the recognition that their work had become a template for development that served existing communities rather than displacing them. More importantly, Regina continued, the legal framework Ms. Carter developed for challenging exploitative property ownership has been used to investigate questionable land titles in 6 other neighborhoods. 3 families have successfully reclaimed properties that were fraudulently taken from their grandparents. Bradley watched the crowd's reaction with a mixture of pride and humility. When he'd first encountered Regina at Le Bernardin, he'd been celebrating the acquisition of property through the same exploitative patterns his great-grandfather had established. Now he was part of a movement that challenged those patterns and created alternatives. But the most significant development, Regina said, is the establishment of the Martinez Vaughn Foundation for Historical Justice. She gestured toward a banner at the front of the room displaying the foundation's logo, 2 interlocking circles, representing the design from both family rings, but now completed rather than separated. The foundation will use resources from the Vaughn family estate to research and address cases of historical property theft, support community land ownership, and provide legal assistance to families seeking to reclaim stolen inheritances. The announcement drew sustained applause, but Regina held up her hand for quiet. This work is possible because someone with inherited wealth chose to examine how that wealth was built and chose transformation over preservation of unjust systems. Bradley felt the weight of recognition, but also the ongoing responsibility that came with using inherited privilege for justice rather than personal comfort. The past 18 months had cost him most of his business relationships, several $1 million in reduced profits, and his standing in the social circles that had once defined his identity. But they'd also given him something he'd never known he was missing, the satisfaction of building rather than extracting value, the relationships that came from genuine partnership rather than transactional interaction, and the understanding that wealth was only meaningful when it served purposes larger than individual accumulation. I want to say something, Bradley said, standing to address the room. 18 months ago, I thought development was about maximizing profit from undervalued properties. I thought success meant buying low, building high, and selling to the highest bidder. He paused, looking around the room at faces that had become familiar, residents who'd taught him about community, activists who'd shown him what authentic leadership looked like, children who'd helped him understand what legacy actually meant. But Regina and all of you taught me that real development is about growing communities, not just buildings. That real wealth comes from creating value for everyone, not extracting it for a few. As the meeting concluded and people gathered in small groups to continue conversations about Phase 2 planning, Regina found herself back in the gallery, standing before the display of rings that had started everything. Thinking about your grandmother? Bradley asked, joining her. "Thinking about all the grandmothers," Regina replied. "All the families who lost property, who had to start over, who carried stories they couldn't tell because the truth was too dangerous or too painful." She touched the display case gently. "But also thinking about how their stories are finally being told, how their losses are finally being acknowledged, how their grandchildren are finally able to build something from the truth instead of living with buried secrets." Bradley nodded, understanding that their work was about more than housing development or community organizing. It was about the possibility of breaking cycles of exploitation that had persisted for generations, creating models for how inherited advantage could serve justice rather than perpetuate injustice. "What's next?" he asked. Regina smiled, thinking of the folders of documents from other families who'd contacted the foundation, the communities across the country interested in replicating their model, the possibility that individual transformation could become systemic change. "Everything," she said. "We've proven that one family's wealth can be used to heal instead of harm. Now we get to find out how many other families are ready to examine their inheritances and choose transformation." Do you believe that the most valuable inheritances aren't material possessions, but the courage to face truth and the commitment to use whatever resources we have, whether wealth, knowledge, or simply voice, in service of justice? Sometimes the greatest gifts we can give future generations are the cycles we choose to break and the partnerships we choose to build. As the Harlem Community Heritage Center settled into its evening quiet, Regina and Bradley stood together in the gallery, surrounded by artifacts of a painful past and evidence of a hopeful future. The rings in their display case caught the last light of day, no longer symbols of separation and theft, but reminders that even the most entrenched patterns of exploitation could be transformed when people chose truth over comfort, partnership over domination, and justice over the maintenance of unjust systems. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with the energy of people who'd learned they had power not just to resist displacement, but to shape development in ways that honored their history while creating space for their dreams. It was the sound of community wealth being built by community wisdom, guided by the understanding that true prosperity belonged to everyone or it belonged to no one at all. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility and grounded in the recognition that inherited debts could become inherited opportunities when people chose to pay them forward rather than pass them on.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.